Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll talk about the ego again, but we'll talk about it from another perspective. We'll talk about the ego being its truest, let's say, self. I almost said self. Its truest self in the moment of disease. Now, to talk about that, we'll have to talk about the ego as a body, as a narrative body to be precise, and then talk about the implications of that for the contents that it, let's say, includes. And we have to talk about the background, that which lays behind the ego, and then why the ego is sort of its truest self in the moments of disease. Now, as you know, on this channel, we talk a lot about the Jungian perspective of psychoanalysis and psychology, so the perspective of psychoanalyst Carl Jung on the psyche as a whole. In this video, we'll again diverge from this a little bit. Whenever we talk about the ego, I also add the perspective of narrative psychology because I think this fits very well with the Jungian framework. Well, let's get right into it. So the ego at the most fundamental level, and I've talked about this in many videos, is considered a body because it builds a narrative that is put together into what I would call, and I'll advance this term in this video, I haven't advanced this in other videos, what I would call a corpus. A corpus as an interpretive framework that in its whole is dead. Now, why is it dead? Because the ego essentially attempts to build a stable framework from which we can move into the future. Now, this movement into the future is precisely only possible because there is a stable core, because we have a core that we can go out into the world with and interpret. This interpretation, of course, requires a stable base. It requires that we know, sort of have a firm standing. A young child is afraid of sort of novelty for the reason, or someone who's unexperienced as well in certain contexts is afraid of novelty precisely because this novelty is unknown to them. And because they don't have the tools that they can sort of adjust, wiggle, in order to understand or interpret this novelty. Now, novelty is always scary to all of us, but the level of anxiety depends on the tools and the flexibility of those tools that you have. Now, a very young child, I have young children, and those young children, they when there's something entirely, new to them, which we would consider unproblematic, let's say darkness, right? Like children are afraid of the dark for multiple reasons, but one reason being that they can't see, which means they can't categorize the elements that they may encounter, which means they cannot precisely, determine what consequences these elements may have for them. And this is precisely the perspective that the ego works with. It's a sort of a consequence-driven model, right? The idea is that, oh, there's a ball, I can kick it. And the action triggered by the perception of the ball is the kicking, not the ball itself, in a way. And so the ego precisely is considered by me, and I believe this to be a valid framework, as a corpus, as dead, as crystallizing, because that's precisely what it does. The ego goes out and takes an element that is dynamic in the first instance and crystallizes it in an image that it then projects into the future. Now, this is true particularly for elements that are encountered multiple times. Now, let's for example take the example of a certain food that I can eat. Let's take the example of a banana. Maybe a banana is considered to be edible. Now, the reason why it's considered to be edible is maybe because our parents have been eating it. Maybe because our parents have told us that it's good to eat. They gave it to us. They were like, yeah, this is fine, you can eat this. We ate it, it was fine, we could eat this, so we continue to eat it. We consider a banana that we see in most places fine to eat. Now, it has to fulfill certain criteria, perhaps. It can't be brown, it can't be mushy, but if it fulfills these criteria, it's good to eat. Now, what if we learned that all bananas were poisonous? Like, always. Because, in fact, the bananas that we actually eat, the concrete bananas, are entirely different from the bananas that we think are edible. Because these bananas that we think are edible are represented by a crystallized category in the structure of the ego as a whole. Now, the reality of the bananas is entirely different. This becomes pertinent and I think very obvious when we take the example of people. Now, you consider maybe your partner to be a stable element. today you'll be the same as tomorrow, and then the day after you'll be the same. But what if your partner suddenly discovers a liking for sodomy, let's say? Maybe some of us will like it. Maybe some of us will be appalled. And certainly if they have never had this propensity, you will be quite shocked. Maybe not fundamentally shocked. Perhaps you will. It depends on the other presumptions in your ego. But certainly you haven't predicted it. And this is precisely the sort of the idea of the ego. The ego always attempts to predict. It attempts to predict a stable future. And this is precisely why it has to crystallize the elements that are otherwise dynamic. Now, your partner can choose to be whatever they want to be. They can be sodomist today and a Christian tomorrow. It doesn't matter. You know, supposedly they have this freedom. Now, again, I don't believe they have this freedom. I have to write this down. I'll make a video on free will and why I don't believe we have free will. Maybe later. But your partner technically is in constraints. They're free to do whatever they want. Now you think they're not. For you, they are what they are, and they ought to stay what they are, precisely because that is the fundament of you predicting the future for yourself that involves them somehow. Now, you do this for all elements, and this is precisely what the ego does. It crystallizes elements, and this is why I call it a corpus, a sort of dead body. Like it's a narrative, I say it's a narrative body, the ego, but what it actually is a corpus, a narrative corpus, right? A story, when you write it down, a book, when you write it, the book is written. There can be changes made to the book, but those changes are annotations, they're footnotes. They're not really changes to the corpus of the book, because once it's printed, it's printed. The idea, however, is that the crystallized elements, as I pointed out, continue to develop. The elements within the corpus inevitably continue to develop. Now, your partner, again, as I said, may change what they want to do. They may change who they want to be from one day to the other. But and this is precisely here the idea. The ego essentially has built this stiff structure, what I would refer to as sort of, or with Roland Barthes, I refer to it as the Studium, its fixed interpretation of the world, while the world always continues to change. Now, why is the truth of the ego to be found in moments of disease? The idea here is precisely derived from what I just told you, right? The idea here is that, excuse me, I have to write down the timestamps. The idea is that behind the layer that the ego has built, behind this interpretive layer, this studium, lies the actual nature of the ego. Now, this doesn't mean that there's some kind of magical, true treasure to be found here. I do not think so. But it means on the first level that behind this layer of this fixed layer of the ego, this studium, is the sort of the noise, the white noise of the world in quotation marks, beyond the interpretation of the ego. Now, if the ego breaks down, which happens here metaphorically in the moment of disease, new material influxes into the ego. And this new material precisely challenges the ego to develop. It challenges the ego to challenge the assumptions that it made about certain elements within its own continuity. And this precise challenge is the attempt to find truth in the ego. This precise challenge is what Jung referred to as the individuation process. It's not you attempting to be like, oh my God, actually I am an artist. I'm not this corporate person. I am an artist. That is not what Jung wanted. Jung wanted you not to go ahead again and crystallize just something else that you saw on TV was meant to be real or somehow more creative. You know, everyone always thinks because you're individuating, you're suddenly creative. You know, like it's suddenly this. It's like, no, who says that suddenly you're creative? Maybe you're not creative. Maybe that's precisely what you don't, what you're not. You know, but in any case, every kind of every kind of new element that you sort of enter within this continuity of the ego is again building or rebuilding the corpus of the ego, the structure, this precise structure that that sort of separates you, literally builds a bar and separates you from the world. Now, the idea here is that only in the moment when this bar breaks down, there is the possibility for new material to influx into the ego, and then the ego to sort of having to deal with this material. And this now can happen in moments of, only in moments precisely of negative judgment. So moments that I call negative judgment, which are moments of trauma, essentially ruptures of the ego structure. It can only happen when you encounter something that you hadn't assumed to be the way you encounter it to be. Now, this means precisely that these encounters can only occur when you're dealing with the world. So when you're dealing with something that is not considered the ego. This doesn't mean, obviously, that you have to sort of deal with the external world necessarily, because there's a lot of within you. This is stupid in Jungian terms, but within you, let's say, in your personal unconscious or whatever, that you don't know that is there, right? There's a lot of material in collective, in products of the psyche, like fairy tales and so on, that may be considered to be traumatizing. But the idea is that precisely this notion, this moment of rupture, is your best chance to continue to fuel this process of individuation. And for me, I think individuation is precisely the sort of the voluntary encounter of the elements of the non-ego that will propel you to sort of develop or move forward. Now, don't worry, life presents you with these moments at any point in time, right? It presents you with these moments precisely because it is the natural tendency of the ego to develop, the self, which is the objective core of the psyche, that which you individuate towards the wholeness of the psyche. The material in the non-ego it presents itself, it moves towards you. And this is also why I believe, or why I put forth the hypothesis that there is no need to individuate actively, because as long as you have the openness that your ego isn't the sort of the fixed everything that it is, you don't have to do anything. The material of the non-ego presents itself. You will unfold into the direction you're supposed to unfold in. Now, be cautious, because the ego is continuing to grow in strength and power, let's say, in modern society, because it is required to do so. But technically, Jung says that just like the seed will grow into a tree, the ego will grow into the self. Now, the self simply being the self isn't different from the ego, if you will. It is simply the ego when it integrated everything that is non-ego, which is impossible, right? Because then it wouldn't be ego anymore. And thus we would be dead, because we can't exist without an ego, as you may have concluded, because we need the ego to navigate in the world. You'd be psychotic, essentially, hypothetically. But the problem is, of course, that the ego has precisely these defense mechanisms that block it from this development. And that is why, and I'll conclude on this notion, it is our duty in a way to continue to expose ourselves not to sort of the same that we always expose ourselves to, but to novelty, to precisely that which we're scared of. Go into the point that you think is darkest for you, and that's where you find your truth. Not because that's where the truth is, but because it'll rupture that which you think you are. And that's why social media, by the way, and I made a video on this, go and watch it if you want. Social media is so dangerous because it always exposes us to the self. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. To the same kind of the same material that we've always encountered before. It's these filter bubbles that form, right? Now, thank you for watching this video. I appreciate it. And if you're interested in more of the content, then please consider to subscribe, and do leave a comment below, because I am curious to learn what you think about this material. Thanks a lot.